So, as introduced, my name is Shani Rozanes. I'm working for the Israeli Consulate here. I'm the Director of Events and Public Programming in the city for 3.5 years now. We will be discussing the Israeli angle of all of what we've discussed all day, and I think it's going to be more of a personal discussion, I think, than and we will obviously would like to hear from you too, and we'll open the floor for some questions. But I'd like to start with introducing our great guests today. The first one is, you have that in your program. The first one is Dr. Achi Ludmirsky. He's the Director of Pediatric Cardiology at the NYU Langone Medical Center. He is here since 1984. He came here to study and then made such a great career, moving up the ladder and becoming one of a great expert in the field of children cardiology. And we also have with him, he's not as good looking as Mili Avital, but he's definitely as fascinating and successful as Mili is. We have here Oren Hyman, who's a lawyer, and he's a partner at the Shibolet, the Israeli partner, and I think founder of the American branch of Shibolet, New York. So he's in law, and one is we have a doctor, we have a lawyer, we have a good Jewish crowd. That's how it works. Okay, we can mark them off. What we will try to do is try and see how, if at all, being an Israeli, coming into an American environment, an American Jewish environment, or an American non-Jewish environment, how does it affect one's life and career and personal choices? And then we also have the question about the second generation, and also, of course, battling with the question of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionist sentiments, the question of Zionism in general. How do Israelis, we Israelis, I'll let myself include myself as in that panel, how do we experience it, and how do we, how do we project that and move on with that? So I think I think that what's the fascinating thing was, when I was introduced to have this panel, and I think when the organizer had that in mind, I think it was obvious to them that there must be a way in which Israelis are being somewhat, looked aside. I mean, the fact, your background, how it must be affecting their, their lives and their professional careers. And to my great surprise and somewhat relief, I was happy to hear from both of our guests that they don't feel that at all. And maybe I'd like them to elaborate a bit on how they see their experiences maybe as immigrants in America, and how has that, affected their choices here of life and career here. Achi, would you like to start, maybe?
Sure. So, good afternoon to everyone. And
it's not on. No, it is on. You need to speak closer.
יותר קרוב? Okay.
אתה יכול להחזיק את זה ביד, יש לנו שניים, אחד לכל אחד. Okay, and I'll join you guys.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, so it's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation. And the only thing I can share is my personal experience, my family experience. So as Shani introduced us, I came here to do my fellowship in pediatric cardiology. The idea is to be here for 2 years, and 30 years later, I'm still here. As that's a typical story of a lot of physicians here. Israeli physicians that are very, very well appreciated and respected in the United States. And we can talk about that why a little bit later. So when I left the country, I was absolutely sure I'm going to be here for 2 years, and then I'm going back. I didn't even lease my apartment, didn't sell my cars, kept all the equipment the same. And probably this was the same thing for 12 years. We always bought 220 current, because tomorrow we're going back, right? That didn't happen, and after 12 or 13 years, we decided that's not the right way to live. And we changed, and we can talk about it later. But through my academic career, As I told Shani before, I really didn't feel any discrimination. I was equal to other foreigners in our fellowship program. And we have several other people from other countries, European, Japan. I didn't feel any discrimination because I was Israeli. Yes, they look at us differently as foreigners. There's no doubt about that. But as specifically Israeli or a Jew, I didn't feel any change or any different from other members of my academic unit. As a foreigner, it's a different story. So you have to prove yourself, and you have to work 7 times harder in order to prove yourself, because otherwise you're going to hear what is this foreigner is doing here and why we are preparing and why we are educating the foreigner if he's not going back to his own country. We don't want any competition with us. And I think this was much more remarkable. And from a personal experience, I started at Texas and then went to the Midwest in Michigan and St. Louis, and I'm in New York now 5 years. And it's a little bit different in each part of the country. I never practiced in California, so I don't know exactly what's going on, but I can definitely compare a little bit what's going in Texas and Midwest and New York. But this is just in very short sentence what I think about really quote-unquote discrimination as an Israeli or Jew. Definitely in New York area, a lot of people will come and ask me about Israel and what's going on, and if there is any events in Israel, they'll come and talk to me, but that's because most NYU is, and a lot of people are from Judaism background. In Texas, you don't have it because, believe me, in Texas, they much more interested in the football results of the Friday high school. That's much more important than what's going in Israel.
Can you hear me?
I think this works.
No. Good afternoon. Congratulations for everyone who managed to stay here for 6 or 7 hours, I'm counting. I think a round of applause for people who on a Sunday spend the day coming together, a lot of Jews, some Israelis, to talk about these kind of topics. Congratulations to the crowd. There is absolutely nothing interesting about me. I'm filling the role of Mili Avital, who is a phenomenal Israeli actress. And I'd like to talk to you about how much I adore Mili Avital. I think that would be an interesting topic to start off with. And this is the closest I've ever come to her, sitting on a chair which she was supposed to sit on. So I'm getting there. Thank you, Shani, for inviting me. Thank you very much, Simcha and Yaakov Chagoel and the WZO, who, like many other organizations, Jewish organizations in New York, are starting to recognize that Israelis are not regular American Jews, they're weird American Jews. They're very weird, they're very peculiar, they're very different than the American Jews here. I think that when we're talking about anti-Semitism, and this is personally my experience, I think there's more feeling of social stress or animosity between American Jews and Israelis, and between Israelis and American Jews, than there are between Jews and non-Jews in New York. I truly believe that. I truly feel that. I truly feel that. I spent exactly half of my life in the U.S. and half in Israel, so I'm not sure if I'm more Israeli or more American Jew, but Israelis, fresh off the boat Israelis here, they feel, on one hand, superior in many ways to the American Jewry. They're very self-confident, maybe overconfident is the word. They feel that they can teach the American Jews about Judaism, about Israel, about pluralism, about how to do business. You guys have only been here, what is it, like 500 years, 700 years? We'll show you how business is done here. I show you. I show you how we do real estate, we do limousine, how we do diamond business. And on the other... Somebody didn't like that last comment. And on the other hand, American Jews are looking at these Israelis coming in here and saying, you know, you're from Israel. With all due respect, you come from the Middle East. Your English isn't great. Your academic background is from Israel and not from Texas or from St. Louis. And it would be nice if you chose some modesty, some respect, be a better listener. We can show you how business is done in the U.S. We can show you how organizations work in the U.S. We can show you how to build communities. We can show you, we can teach you what Reform synagogue or conservative or modern Orthodox. These are things that you ask an Israeli 5 years after he landed in the U.S., he has no idea what it is you're talking about. When you come to an Israeli on his 5th year here and you say, why don't you come over to services in my synagogue? And he says, sure, I'll come over. He says, okay, this is the website, buy tickets. He says, what do you mean buy tickets? You don't buy tickets to a synagogue. I'm not going to pay to be a member with God. I'm just going to show up like I do in Israel. There are so many elements, there are so many things that are different between Israeli Jews coming to New York and American Jews who've been living here for many, many years, that my feeling as a part of both worlds is that the kind of things that we're speaking about, the disrespect, the fact that we're being labeled as Jews by non-Jews, is it an anti-Semitism or an anti-Israeli type of discussion going on in the Congress? We're feeling it on a day-to-day life much more between the Israelis and the American Jews. It's interesting. I like to compare this to when I see, I don't know, I see a Chinese and a Japanese on the street. I say, well, they probably know each other. They probably know, they eat the same food, they speak the same language, they listen to the same music. All of their letters look weird. A Chinese doesn't feel closer to a Japanese than he does to a German and to an American. But from my perspective as a non-Japanese and a non-Chinese, I think that these communities are more or less the same. And I think that the way that people who are not part of this room see Israelis and American Jews were defined as, they're probably very, very similar. It's the same culture, it's the same food, it's the same music, it's the same type of Judaism. And there are very big differences.
I think, well, as you guys can probably sense, this is becoming, I think, unlike most of the day that was checking us Jews versus the world, this will be more of us Jews within ourselves and how we deal with each other. But I think maybe Achi, I remember, Achi's here since 1984, and he raised 3 great kids and has grandkids already that are here in America. But he told me one sentence that struck me when we talked. He said, I don't have a house in America. My house is still in Israel. He confessed, if I can share that with the room, he starts the day every day with reading the 3 leading Israeli newspapers before he moves on. So, and Oren himself, part of the many great things that he does in the cities that he recently, he initiated and helps forming the local Israeli council, Moatza Mekomit, who is a representative and communal organization trying to bring together Israelis. And I think this duality is something that you never actually get rid of after 30 years, do you, Achi? Maybe tell us a bit about.
Well, you call it duality. I call it schizophrenia, and it's definitely that. It's a schizophrenic state, and the question is, are you inherit this schizophrenic situation to your kids? And I can tell you, again, everyone has a different family and a different style, but for my wife and myself, we are definitely in a schizophrenic state. We, as Shani told you, I don't start the day without going over all the Israeli newspaper. My people that work with me, they know that until 8:15 they don't bother me because I'm not going to answer unless a patient is in a problem. But beyond that, if we just jump one generation, and if you're going to talk to my kids, and they're not young anymore, still kids, but not as young, they'll tell you that when they go to Israel, the Israelis look at them as American. When they go to college here, their friends in college look at them as Israelis. And that's, for me, again, we are continuing the duality of the schizophrenic state. How to solve it, and it's a major problem from them because it's really affecting their feeling, they're affecting their identity, who we are. And it's very interesting. I have 3 kids that 2 came with me when they were 4 and 8. One is a native Texas that no one believed because she was born there. And it's funny because when she applied to one of the universities, one of the questions is, what do you think your friends don't know about you? And she wrote that I'm a native Texan because no one believed that. And so when you go, and it's really depend, in my mind, on what you give your kids at home. Everything starts at home. We can have great synagogues, we can have great, the Israeli school after hours, we can get the Israeli scouts, we can do a lot of things that are available, but if you don't start at home, it's not gonna work. And I know that a lot of work and effort is being done right now towards the next generation. Not that the Israeli government gave up on the first generation that came here, but there is a hope that maybe we can save the next generation. But if you don't start at home, it's very difficult. And by starting at home, I'm talking about speaking Hebrew, that they'll be at least bilingual, sometimes more, keep the tradition. Because if you don't do that, the chance that your kids are not going to have any identity and they're not going to be either Israelis or Jews, you are, and I don't know, I don't want to speak about the 3rd generation and beyond that, but if they don't have these fundamentals, it's going to be very difficult.
Nope. Yep. I'll give Oren the chance to reply because when he told me is that he is aspiring to be, his identity is 200%, 100% American and 100% Israeli, and sort of insisting on the ability to hold, to have the cake and keep it whole, I guess, So maybe you respond to Achi because he's talking about.
We are going through a renaissance now. I don't know how many people in this room are familiar with what's going on in the Knesset, what's going on in the Jewish Agency, what's going on in the Israeli press, what's going on in New York City, what's going on in Toronto, what's going on in Miami. Has anybody here been to the Museum of Diaspora in Israel? So the long name of the Museum of Diaspora is the Museum of Jewish Diaspora. And we're talking about the 13, 14 million Jews living around the world, of which we have 7 million people living in Israel. About 6 million of them are Jews. And all of these numbers are running around the world. The Pew Report, the fact that the number of Jews is increasing or decreasing, and the orthodoxy of the Jewish population is increasing. None of these reports, none of the discussions until 2 years ago mentioned the word Israeli. Does anybody know how many Israelis at this moment? There are 8 million people in the world defining themselves as Israelis. How many of them live outside of Israel? Over 1 million. There is a diaspora of over 1 million people who speak Hebrew, define themselves as Israeli. 650,000 of them are living in North America. There is no public document that mentions the word Israeli diaspora. You talk about the Russian Jewish diaspora, you can read reports about that. The Ethiopian Jewish diaspora, you can talk about the Syrian Jews, you can talk about the Iranian Jews. Nobody talks about the Israeli Jews. It doesn't exist. And we're talking 1 million people. So over the last 2 or 2.5 years, all of a sudden, you go to Miami and there is an Israeli community center in Miami, and there's one in San Francisco, and there are 40,000 Israelis in Toronto that are now structured as a community, and the Israeli community in London, and in Melbourne, there are 3,000 Israelis, members of the AIA, the Australian Israeli Association. And this is all new. It didn't exist before. There was either you're part of the local community or you're part of the Jewish community. You cannot be part of an Israeli community. And this is something which is happening this year in New York. For the first time in 65 years, the IJAs, put it in whatever order you want, the Israeli Jewish Americans, The Americans don't, as Achi says, don't see us as Americans. The Israelis definitely don't see us as Israelis. The Jews see us as weird Jews. And finally, there is a center, a place, a organization, a website, a school, a cultural organization that sees these weird 150,000 Israeli Jews living in the New York area and bringing them together. I don't know how many people here heard of Arik Einstein, the Israeli singer. Well, 10 days ago when he passed away, I don't know if I got 1,000 or 2,000 emails and Facebook posts of friends saying, this has been a tragedy for Israel, for Israelis living here. Like, let's get together, let's commemorate, let's celebrate, let's sit Shiv'ah on Arik Einstein. He's the combination of the Bruce Springsteen with the John Lennon, this is what we all grew up upon. All our kids' songs, all our children's songs are Arik Einstein. All of the military songs are Arik Einstein. All the I Love Israel songs are Arik Einstein. And I run a law firm with 25 attorneys. Some of them are Israelis, some of them are American Jews. The American Jews had no idea what I was talking about. Oren, why are you so depressed? Why are you canceling your meetings? What happened? And I said, well, Arik Einstein died. He said, who? I said, well, the #1 Israeli culture icon. You mean, did you say David Broza? I said, no. Idan Reichel? No. Arik Einstein, they don't know who Arik Einstein is. So there is a big gap, and by establishing a local Israeli community structure, we're hoping to bring the Israelis together and help them slowly adopt and adjust to being American Jews, understanding how the synagogue process works, what Jewish community organizations mean, what is the AZM, what is the UJA. Ask 10 Israelis that have been here for 5 years, what is the UJA? They wouldn't know. 80% of them wouldn't know to tell you what that means. Although our biggest supporter now is the Federation in New York. Moatza Mekomit, the Israeli Council in New York, were a group of 80 local community Israeli leaders who came together and are part of a board of a new organization. And the Federation, the Jewish Federation, is now coming out of the closet and saying, Israelis, you are also a part of the Jewish world. And we want to make sure that you come together, that you create programming together. You be proud of your Israeliness. Be part of the Jewish family. Just one last point. When you look at what's happening in Israel, 30 years ago, late Prime Minister Rabin spoke in a Yom Ha'atzmaut, in a Address the Nation speech, and the reporter asked him about, how do you feel about Israelis living Israel? He says, any Israeli living Israel is a traitor. And the word traitor, the word aliyah, how many people here know the word aliyah? Aliyah is migrating to Israel. Aliyah is also going up, it's ascending. Anybody leaving Israel, for 65 years we've been using the term yerida, going down. You're inferior, you're leaving, you're abandoning. If an American moves to Italy, nobody says, hey, abandoner, what's going on? How's it in Italy? What's going on in Israel, led surprisingly by the Jewish Agency, is recognizing the fact that Israelis have the moral right to migrate. This is a global village, and if you want to go to school in Texas, or if you want to move to Australia and live there, you're entitled to, just like any other country in the world. Nobody is going to look down on an American Jew living in Nebraska saying that you are a bad person because you're not moving to Israel. Israel is the Jewish homeland. Every Jew is either going to be living in Israel or is going to be called a traitor. That doesn't work with American Jews. That should not work with Israelis choosing to live abroad. And this is the new discussion going on in Israel, very much supported by the Jewish Agency.
Yes, and that brings me straight to my next question. Is this working? Yeah. Yes? Okay. First of all, I want to take one step back. I keep calling you Achi, but this is a professor. We need to give him the right respect. It's okay.
You can call me professor.
I can call you. Well, yes, definitely. I'd like to ask you, Achi, what's your stand on Zionism? Would you, after 30 years living outside of Israel, still consider yourself a Zionist? And how do you think, the new faces of Zionism are manifested in this schizophrenic, identity that you were mentioning?
Very good question.
You never asked me this question before, so it's so again, I think I have a long conversation about it because I think everyone has his own Zionism. I don't think we can put everyone under the same roof and send anyone on the same criteria. We know when our parents and grandparents established Zionism, maybe it was one thing. For me, Zionism is my private Zionism is that every time I go to Israel, and thank God my parents are still alive, I have a lot of friends. All my social support system is in Israel. It's not here. I have American friends. They are not on the same level as my Israeli friend, and it's very clear. My Israeli friends are from the army that I spent 5 years. I fought 3 wars with them. It's a completely different level of friendship that we still keep 30 years later, even though we left Israel. But I can tell you, we moved to New York 5 years ago. I haven't seen any Israeli that doesn't come to New York 10 times a year. Everyone comes to New York. Not everyone comes to St. Louis, but to New York, everyone comes. But for me, my Zionism is the fact that every time I go to Israel, I volunteer in the hospitals there. And I feel a fulfillment for myself on a personal level, and I feel that I can contribute something to the community, to the healthcare system in Israel. And if we compare both healthcares, and we're not going to go there today because then we're going to be here until tomorrow, I can tell you the healthcare in Israel, on a personal level, I believe that an individual in Israel is getting a better healthcare than in the United States. When I go, and I know several of my friends that are physicians, we usually go and we try to do and contribute as much as we can to the healthcare in Israel completely on a voluntary basis. That's the way, this is my own private Zionism. On a global way, I think, again, we are going here now, and it also depends on your religion, depend on your tradition, but I think, to keep Israel as a very strong Jewish country, I think this is the Zionism. And, some people talk to me about 15 years ago and ask me, why do you think of going back to Israel? And they told me the only thing that will bring you back because if you are a Zionist. And I said, well, I see Zionism a little bit different. Everyone sees different. And I can tell you, and as Oren mentioned, Professor Oren, sorry, the debate is significantly right now in Israel. The treasurer minister talk about people, the traitors that now are moving predominantly to Berlin and other places and it's caught fire from both sides. And it's really, if you read on Twitter and Facebook, the response that people with anger on both sides, it doesn't help. It doesn't help. But for me, Zionism is to keep and support Israel in the best way.
Excellent. It's a very personal question. I agree with Achi. If Achi was speaking now to a group of such distinguished people in Israel, I think that there would be some laughter from the crowd, or at least there would have been laughter 10 years ago. Achi, you grew up in Israel. You served in the military. You pay taxes in Israel. You all of your friends, your family living in Israel. You left Israel for career purposes, to make more money, because you thought that academically it'll be a more exciting environment in the US. For whatever reason it is. How could you define yourself as Zionist? Zionism is creating, maintaining, supporting a Jewish homeland in Israel, and you left Israel, so how can you call yourself a Zionist? And 10 years ago, I think that the answer was you couldn't. And if you lived in Israel and left Israel, it doesn't matter how many times you visit Israel, how much you donate to Israeli causes, how many hospitals you volunteer for when you're in Israel. If there's a war, God forbid, in Israel, how many of our doctors? My father was a doctor living in St. Louis in Milchemet Yom Kippurim, in the Yom Kippur War, and he left us for 3 months to come to Israel to join the Army Medical Corps in order to service. But nevertheless, my father chose to move to the U.S. So at that time, 50 years ago, and also 10 years ago, you could not even mention the word Zionist if you're an Israeli choosing to live abroad. So, and I don't know how many people are Israeli in the room? Define themselves as Israeli? Okay, there are about 7 or 8. Do you guys feel that you're Zionist? The 8 of us that are here? Yeah, we feel Zionist. You'd get laughter in Israel 10 years ago in a crowd like this, because this is...
Non-Israelis also define themselves as Zionists here in this room?
How many non-Israelis define themselves as Zionists? We're all spending our Sunday afternoon, instead of playing tennis, coming together and talking about Jewish causes. Of course we're Zionists. We care about our religion, we care about our tradition, we care about our nationality. Being Jewish is a nationality. There is one country in the world which we care about despite the fact that we don't live there, and that's Israel. If something, God forbid, happens in Israel, if there's a car accident in Israel and 6 people die, we're as sad, or maybe even more, than if something like this happened in Montreal or in San Francisco the same day. We care so much about what's going on in Israel. This is our personal Zionism, what Achi calls it. But this is not the traditional discussion. Traditionally, 40, 50 years ago, we needed Jews in Israel. Somebody had to to pick oranges. Somebody had to fill the military. We needed 1 million soldiers. And if you have 2 million Jews in Israel versus 6 million, it's easier to find 1 million soldiers. Today, the Israeli economy, we do not grow oranges anymore. We do not require Israelis to work in industry. We do not need the manual labor for real estate. We do not need soldiers anymore. An army of 1 million soldiers, now they're talking about 100 or 150,000. This is the era of quality, of the startup nation, rather than the pilgrimage. We need as many Israelis as possible, and many Jews as possible in Israel, to make Israel a success story. We're no longer there. What we need now in Israel to become a success story is more Nobel Prizes. We need more startups. We need more exits. Given Imaging was sold this week for $1 billion. Waze was sold 2 months ago to Google for another $1 billion. This is what Israel's strength is. It's no longer the number of Jews living in Israel. And it takes time. It's going to take a generation for us to adapt to this thought, I think.
As a representative of the Israeli Consulate, I also want to give a little of my touch on this. There's no doubt I agree with both distinguished professors here that there's no doubt there's a change. And I think there's a change. I'll say that from a very personal level of a representative of the young generation. There's a difference in the way the younger generation defines itself. The way of communication today makes the world seem and feel much smaller, and I think that allows people to feel far more flexible in how and where they're planning their lives in the future, far more when both of you have made the change and immigrated. And in that sense, I think that flexibility is also something that is not definite. You travel, you go, you come back. A lot of my friends either came to Israel to study, so came to the U.S. to study, and they're going back. I myself, have been spending 3.5 years here and moving back home, and that's a very natural, part of what we are. Many of my friends have had experiences living abroad because this is, today it's so easy to still keep your connection back home, to where you're, to your roots, and then still be somewhere far. And I think that definitely emotionally the connection is always there. But having said all that, there's no doubt that we don't encourage people to leave Israel, okay? They're welcome to come and live. They are welcome to stay, and we hope that everyone stays and find it happy. And I think that exactly what, part of what we're talking about is the need to make Israel a relevant place for many people, and the current place that people enjoy living in, by allowing, and this is part of what the effort that the consulate is actively involved in the recent years, is making Israel relevant for people to know all the aspects of Israeli life, from science through culture and fashion and medicine and arts and what we call tikkun olam, any other aspect. There are so many aspects and so many ways of being Israeli and identifying with Israel, supporting Israel. We would want to have, we want, to sustain and to support the startup nation. We need investment, and we need American Jews. There's so many of them, either working, in finance or in research or in business. They can be the warmest, hearted Zionists, contributing annually to the bonds or, to their federation but when thinking of making an investment in Israel, that's not even on the radar. That's not even something they're considering. And this is something we're trying to promote and trying to encourage, talking about the new phase of Israel, not just in charity, but also as an investment, something that is for itself, is good, not because your sentiment is there, but because it will pay off. Also, if we're talking about making traveling to Israel, so very few of American Jews have been to Israel. And they love Israel, they sympathize, they can support in so many ways. But then when they're traveling, they're looking for a nice destination. They will never, consider Israel. Some of it has to do with the distance. But even those who travel to Italy or to France or to Greece don't bother and think even of taking 1 hour, 1 extra hour of a flight and landing in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem. So this is part of what we're doing at the consulate here. And I know some of you have been discussing the practicality of what we're doing. How do we implement? How do we change? How do we drive people into actions following all the problems that were discussed here today? I would like to give you both a few minutes for maybe a short remark. No, you know what? Let's open the stage for let's take some questions, and then I'll let you conclude with your remarks if you have any. Yes. Wait, yes. Oh, rotating mics, sure. Yes.
We're streaming this out. We're streaming
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, had I known, well, no.
Okay, she said remarks also. So just the question you asked, which was how many of us feel like we're Zionists and we're not Israeli. When we go to Israel and I say I'm a Zionist, they said, no, you're not. You don't live here. And I feel that my whole life is Israel. We make that choice. I have a husband that's a litigator. Can't go. He's not going. But the truth is, we made that choice just like you made the choice. I don't see any difference. And the things I do, whether it's my organization, to be national president or chairman of the board, or to Israeli dance, whatever it is. But the one thing I do find, and this is my question, is the Israelis, at least that I've been with, I'm trying to make it, not say it badly, they don't get involved. Like, our organization has 5 children's homes. We have 250 projects in Israel. Not one of them thinks about giving us tzedakah for it. So, one of the things we always say is that Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh were allowed to go on the other side of the Jordan. But their first responsibility is that they had to be on the front lines fighting. No one's asking them to fight, but we're asking them in this way, and also politically active, to make statements. Do you find that the Israelis that are living here do give tzedakah to Israel more than America, and also are involved politically to make statements and do things politically, to go to AIPAC and send out, be counted for Israel? That's our organization.
Yeah, the answer is no and yes, in that order. No about philanthropy. Israelis donate per capita significantly less than American Jews, at least in New York, from the research that I've conducted. It changes after we see the changing point at about 10 or 12 years after an Israeli lives here. He becomes, or she becomes, more integrated and more part of the federations, more part of the AIPACs, more part of the way that Jewish life celebrate Israel. In the first few years, philanthropy is very weird for us, very different. In Israel, for many, many years, we have a very high level of taxes, and the government takes care of everything, including paying for synagogues, which I mentioned before. So it takes a while. It's a cultural issue. It's one of the things that American Jews, I think, look down on Israelis, saying that, how do you want to be part of the Jewish community if you don't contribute 5 or 10 or 15% of your annual income to tzedakah, to charity, to the local communities, and sending money back to Israel? On the other hand, as Shani mentioned, I feel that American Jews are donating much more to Harvard and to Columbia than to Tel Aviv University and to Hebrew University. I think none of us comes out clean from this discussion. In respect to politics, we did a survey of 1,600 Israelis living in the US 2 months ago and found that more than 80% strongly support Israel's position. Some of them would say under any conditions, no matter what it is. And some of it is almost always, almost anything that Israel does, we will support, but not everything. But over 80% are strong supporters of Israeli policy among Israelis in the first 10 years. And that changes. We become, at some point of time, we become American Jews where the numbers are a little lower. So from a hasbara perspective, from a public diplomacy perspective, I think that Israel has a very good pool of 1 million ambassadors running around in Berlin and in Melbourne and in London and in New York.
Just one thing about philanthropy. I see the problem is within Israel first, because since it's a high-tech country, a lot of startups and a lot of exits. So there is a layer of people with a lot of money in Israel, and they still didn't do the switch that they have to contribute to community. Now you cannot ask Israelis here to contribute when Israelis that live there and have a lot of money they're not do. And I can tell you, I met with one organization or an established that developed investment, one of the donors to Israel, and he say, I'll match $1 per dollar as long the philanthropy will be from someone from Israel, I'll match it. But until someone from Israel is not taking care of your own people, I'm not going to match. And I think, again, I think it's not a bad idea, even though it's going to hurt Israel at the end. But I think there is a significant layer. I don't want to say 1%, 10%, but if you look at the who is holding the major assets of Israel, it's about 5 to 10% of the population. Until they're not going to start to understand what's philanthropy, to donate to hospitals and education, it's going to be very difficult to ask people from here.
We have this conversation all the time with Israel Emunah, because we're American Emunah. They want us to make money. I say, what about Israel?
You're absolutely right.
And it has been raised.
Let's move to the next. Yes.
Hi, this is a question for the doctor. I have heard that in Israel, it often takes a very long time to get treated. That you're on a list, you may wait a year, 2 years to get things done. There are people in my community in New Jersey who, many of them have children in Israel, they have homes in Israel, they sent their kids to yeshivas in Israel, they're in the IDF as well, and this is what I hear. So I was asking for some kind of confirmation.
So you're not going to get the confirmation from me about that, because the Israeli healthcare is a very interesting healthcare. It's a socialized medicine. So everyone is covered, and the money comes from tax. Everyone tax the amount of 5 or 4, it depends, percent of its own income for healthcare coverage. And that's, I think it's, again, everyone has different ideas, but that's where the money to take care of the population is coming from. So the people make more money, pay more tax. The people don't make money, pay less tax. Now, they always have what they call mashlim. Okay, so you have your own, you can practically be a member of 1 or 2 HMOs, usually 1, and then on top of that, you can have mashlim, so it's something that will complementary to the base treatment that you have. Now, sure enough, if you have this base complementary, you have the complementary service, you can go and pick up any physician that you want and pay this part of complementary that your extra HMO will pay. But I can tell you the situation in Israel is not like in the United Kingdom or Ireland, that you have to wait 2 years for a coronary bypass, and by that time you die. That's absolutely incorrect. You know, I can go and talk about case after case, but by and large, you don't wait for a long time.
We won't make it a discussion about healthcare, but I can say that it's known that there is a gap between whether you live in the center of Israel and you live in the outskirts, where facilities are not, you know, they have fewer facilities and the lines are longer. But in general, I think and of course, you know, being an official representative, Israel is not flawless. You know, we're like any other system, like any other society. But I think that the basic notion is that no person should or can or will go bankruptcy for saving his own life and getting treated. I can tell you from a personal angle, my aunt was a widower who raised 3 kids by herself, and when she got cancer, she got the best treatment, the most, you know, the top of the line, the most, you know, I mean, if it was experimental treatment, whatever it was, you know, with a woman who lived on basic, you know, support from the government through her whole life. So, and this is something we're very proud of. And yes, the system's not flawless, and you know, we're always aspiring to improve, but you know, we need to keep that in mind, and by that I think we'll conclude the healthcare debate.
My question has to do with the kibbutz movement. We used to adore here, at least in my era, the kibbutzim. Can you tell me, or the panel can tell us, how it has evolved and what it's like today?
When the first government in Israel was led by David Ben-Gurion, we had 81 members of the 120 parliament members were kibbutz members. Anybody know how many kibbutz members are part of the parliament this last election? None. 0. There is not a single kibbutz member. There is one? Is he living now in a kibbutz? Okay. So I hear one. I read, I have misinformation. But in any case, the kibbutzim movement used to be a major source of where the Israelis live, how the Israelis live, where government and academia come from, and today it is a very small percentage. There are still kibbutzim. Many of them are privatized. It's more a figure of nostalgia and romance than an actual source of Israeli social community, I think, these days.
That's not, well, that is true that the kibbutzim are not as dominant as they were, and many of them have had really deep crises, economic crisis, social crisis in the 80s and the 90s, and they're not what they used to be. But many of them, there is also at the same time, today you feel a slow but very enthusiastic trend of revival of the young people going back into the kibbutzim, seeing them as ecologic communities, people who want to experiment more with maybe alternative education system and alternative lifestyles that have more to do with earth and being connected to the land. This is happening at the same time as well. It's going to be a different model. The socialist values are not as the core of it as they used to be. But this is evolving into something new and interesting and worth, following for the future.